Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. On the outskirts of a fictional town called Santa Helena, there is an old house that has been passed down from generation to generation in my family. This house, located in a quiet neighborhood and surrounded by tall trees, is known for its Victorian architecture and for keeping many secrets. It was in this house that my grandmother Beatrice lived until her last days, and it was from her that I inherited not only the property, but also a peculiar and mysterious mirror. My name is Anna. I'm 28 years old and I work as an art restorer. I've always been fascinated by antique objects and their stories, which probably explains my insatiable curiosity about the mirror I found in the attic of my grandmother's house. Since I was little, I heard stories about this mirror, which allegedly belonged to a serial killer from the 1920s called Ricardo Alvarez, who believed that the mirror was a door to another dimension. Of course, I always thought these stories were just urban legends until the day I moved into the house. The mirror was dusty and covered with a white sheet. Upon removing the covering, I was struck by the beauty of the object. The frame was dark wood, carved with intricate details that resembled ancient symbols. The surface of the mirror was weathered, but it still reflected a clear image. Ever since I brought the mirror into my room, strange things started happening. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed for no apparent reason, and I could have sworn I heard whispers during the night. At first, I tried to rationalize these events, blaming my imagination or the quirks of an old house. But things started to get more intense and disturbing. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a low, steady sound like scratching, coming from under the floor. I got up and followed the sound into the living room, where I realized it was coming from under the floorboards. Using a flashlight, I shone the area and saw that one of the boards was loose. Carefully, I lifted it and found an empty, dark space. Inside was a small wooden chest, covered in dust and cobwebs. I opened the trunk and, to my horror, found a collection of old belongings of missing residents. Photos, letters, and even jewelry. There was also a diary, written by a woman named Elisa, who appeared to have lived in the boarding house decades ago. Her words were a detailed account of her life at the boarding house and Mr. Oliveira's dark activities. As I read the diary, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Elisa described how Mr. Oliveira performed rituals to appease an evil entity that inhabited the pension. He offered souls as sacrifices to maintain balance and prevent the entity from manifesting. The disappearances were just one part of the horrors that occurred there. "Pedro, I need to show you something," she said, holding the diary with shaking hands. He came to my room and turned pale when he read Elisa's words. "This is worse than we imagined, João. Mr. Oliveira wasn't just performing rituals, he was keeping something trapped here." As we discussed what to do, we started to hear a loud rhythmic sound like heavy footsteps in the hallway. We looked at each other, the expression of fear mirrored on our faces. We grabbed flashlights and went out to investigate. The hallway was deserted, but the sound continued, getting closer and closer. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, but only silence responded. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and a dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was tall and indistinct, with eyes glowing an ominous red. The figure approached slowly, and I felt a biting cold pass through my body. "Did you think you could stop us?" The voice echoed through the corridor, deep and full of malice. Pedro and I backed away, trying to find a way out, but the figure followed us. We ran to the stairs, but the environment around us began to distort. The walls seemed to close in, and the steps multiplied before our eyes. It was as if the boarding house was alive and trying to trap us. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, but Pedro seemed mesmerized, staring at the approaching figure. Suddenly, the figure reached out its hand and I felt an invisible force pull me. I was thrown against the wall and pain exploded through my body. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't respond. Pedro was pulled towards the figure, his eyes filled with terror. "No, please," he begged, but the figure enveloped him in shadows, and he disappeared before my eyes. I stood alone in the dark hallway, the sound of whispers growing around me. I felt a presence approaching and I closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But instead I heard a familiar sound, Elisa's voice, soft and comforting. "John, you need to be strong. The entity is weaker now, but it still has power. Use what you learned in your journal." With difficulty, I got up and went back to my room. I took Elisa's diary and started reading the last pages. It described a banishing ritual, something that could destroy the entity once and for all. She needed specific ingredients and a special place in the boarding house where the energy was strongest. I spent the next day collecting the necessary ingredients, feeling the dark presence around me. The other residents noticed my agitation, but they didn't understand the danger we still faced. At dusk, I prepared to perform the ritual. I went to the basement, where Elisa had mentioned the energy was stronger. The basement was a dark, claustrophobic place, with stone walls and a musty smell. I placed the ingredients on the floor, forming a circle, and began to recite the words of the ritual. The shadows around me stirred, and I felt the presence of the entity approaching. "Do you think you can defeat me?" the voice whispered, full of hate. "You will be just another sacrifice." I continued reciting the ritual, even when the shadows began to envelop me. I felt an icy cold pass through my body, but I couldn't stop. The candlelight flickered, and the dark figure appeared before me, sharper and more menacing than ever. "You can't stop me," she said, stepping forward. With the last bit of energy, I finished the ritual, and an intense light exploded in the basement. The entity screamed in agony, and the shadows began to dissipate. The dark figure disintegrated, leaving only an echo of its scream in the air. Silence took over the basement, and I felt the oppression finally lift. I returned to my room, exhausted but relieved. He knew that the true terror had been defeated, but the scars of those events would remain. As I prepared for bed, I heard one last whisper in the wind, but this time, it was a whisper of peace. "Thank you, John. You freed us." I knew that although we had achieved a victory, the battle against the forces of darkness would never truly end. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that true peace was still beyond our reach and that terror could return at any moment. As we tried to recover from the nightmare we faced in the cabin, the feeling of relief was superficial. Aurora, with its quiet streets and friendly inhabitants, seemed like a safe place at first glance. But the scars from that terrifying night with Arthur were deeply burned into our minds. Mariana and I tried to move forward, but the feeling that something was still very wrong accompanied us at every step. Over the next few days, I started to notice small, disturbing details. Objects in our house moved on their own, doors closed for no apparent reason, and shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. The whispers I thought I left in the cabin began to infiltrate my dreams, turning each night into a harrowing nightmare. One afternoon, while Mariana was at the school where she worked, I decided to investigate more about the cabin and the strange event we experienced. I went to the local library and started researching old records and urban legends about the area. I found mention of an ancient cult that practiced dark rituals in the forest around Aurora. The cult worshipped an entity called the Elder of Shadows and believed that human sacrifices were necessary to maintain balance between the world of the living and the dead. The more I read, the more the feeling of oppression increased. The descriptions of the rituals were horrific, and the connection to what Arthur had tried to do became clearer and clearer. I found an old diary, written by one of the cult members who had regretted his actions. It described how the cult had been disbanded decades ago, but warned that the entity was still lurking, waiting to be released again. I left the library with a sense of urgency. He needed to tell Mariana what he had discovered. When I got home, I found her sitting on the couch, pale and wide-eyed. "Lucas, something happened while you were gone," she said, her voice shaking. I received a call from an unknown number. A voice whispered my name and said that the Elder of Shadows was coming for us. My heart skipped a beat. I knew we couldn't stand by and wait for terror to find us again. We decided to return to the forest and destroy any trace of the cult, hoping to lift the curse once and for all. That night, with a flashlight and the repentant cult member's diary in hand, we ventured back into the forest. The atmosphere was even heavier and more oppressive than before, and the feeling of being watched accompanied us at every step. We followed the instructions in the diary until we found the cabin, now in ruins and overgrown with vegetation. We entered the hut, lighting the way with the flashlight. Shadows danced on the walls, and whispers seemed to come from all directions. We found the makeshift altar where Arthur had tried to perform the ritual. The melted candles and strange symbols were covered in dust and cobwebs. "We need to destroy this," said Mariana, with determination. "We have to end the connection between this place and the entity." We started breaking the altar and tearing up the symbols on the walls. But as we destroyed the remains of the cult, the shadows became more restless and the whispers more intense. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I quickly turned around, but didn't see anything. Panic started to take over me, but I knew we couldn't stop. "Lucas, recite the words from the diary," cried Mariana, her voice full of despair. With shaking hands, I opened the diary and began to recite the banishment ritual that the repentant member had written. The ancient words came out of my mouth with difficulty, and the shadows around us began to twist and retreat. "May the Elder of Shadows be banished forever. May his influence over this world end now." An intense light emanated from the diary, illuminating the cabin and making the shadows scream in agony. Arthur's form appeared again, but this time his expression was one of pure despair. With one last scream, he and the shadows were consumed by the light, leaving the cabin in absolute silence. Mariana and I fell to the floor, exhausted and relieved. We knew we had achieved an important victory, but the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows never left us. As we held each other, trying to find comfort in each other, I heard one last whisper in the wind. "You cannot escape the Elder of Shadows. We will meet again." And so, even with the apparent victory over the terror we faced, we knew that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the true horror would never completely disappear. With each step we took to leave the cabin, the feeling of relief faded. The way back to the road seemed longer and more ominous. The forest around us was filled with oppressive darkness, and the cold air seemed to chill our bones. Mariana held my hand tightly, and we both knew that the nightmare was far from over. We managed to reach the road, but our car was mysteriously stopped. The engine wouldn't start, and despair began to set in. I looked around, hoping to see any sign of help, but there was only darkness and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. "Lucas, we need to get out of here on foot," said Mariana, her voice shaking with fear. I nodded, and we started walking along the deserted road. The silence was unsettling, and the whispers we had heard in the cabin now seemed to follow us. With each step, the feeling of being watched increased. I looked back several times but saw nothing but darkness. Suddenly, a high-pitched, distorted sound echoed across the road, like a scream of agony. We stopped, our hearts beating wildly. I slowly turned around, and in the distance I saw a tall, indistinct figure. His eyes glowed an intense red, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "It's the Elder of Shadows," whispered Mariana, grabbing my arm. "He found us." Without thinking twice, we started running. The figure followed us, moving with unearthly speed. The shadows around us danced and twisted, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to try to reach us. Panic took over us, and we ran as fast as we could. We arrived at an old wooden bridge that crossed a narrow river. We were about to cross it when the figure appeared right in front of us, blocking our path. His sinister smile revealed sharp teeth, and his eyes gleamed with indescribable malice. "Do you think you can escape?" His voice echoed, distorted and full of hate. "The ritual is not complete. I need one more sacrifice." I looked at Mariana, the terrified expression on her face mirroring my own. We knew there was no escape. The Elder of Shadows slowly advanced, and the bridge shook beneath our feet. In a last act of desperation, I pulled Mariana back and with all my strength, pushed the shadowy figure. To my surprise, it wobbled and the bridge began to crumble. The old wood gave way beneath our weight and we all fell into the river below. The icy water enveloped me, and I felt the current drag me along. I struggled to reach the surface, but something was pulling me down. I saw the face of the Shadow Elder underwater, his evil smile haunting me even in the depths. Mariana was beside me, fighting the current but being pulled under as well. With one last effort, I managed to grab Mariana's hand, and together we rose to the surface. We clung to a rock, panting and exhausted. The Shadow Elder was no longer visible, but we knew he was still there, waiting. We managed to pull ourselves out of the river and drag ourselves to the bank, shivering with cold and fear. The forest around us was silent, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We were alive, but the terror we had faced would mark us forever. As we walked back to the road, I heard a final whisper in the wind. "We will meet again, Lucas. This is not the end." And so, even with the apparent victory over the terror we faced, we knew that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the true horror would never completely disappear. At San Lucas Hospital, located in the isolated city of Santa Helena, stories and rumors have been running through the halls for years. New employees hear whispers from older colleagues about a mysterious patient kept in the basement under constant surveillance but never visited. This dark legend of a patient who arrived under inexplicable circumstances is told in low, cautious tones. However, for Clara, a recently graduated nurse eager for adventure, this story was an opportunity to unravel a mystery that everyone seemed to fear. My name is Clara. As a recent nursing graduate, I have always been drawn to riddles and curious about the unknown. When I started my work at San Lucas Hospital, the stories about the unknown patient left me intrigued. No one knew exactly who he was or why he was there, and the details were vague and frightening. Some said he was the victim of an occult ritual, others that he was possessed by an evil force. The hospital, an old and imposing-looking building, had a heavy atmosphere. The walls were a worn white, and the tall windows allowed just enough sunlight to filter through to create unsettling shadows in the hallways. The nights were especially disturbing, with the sounds of echoing footsteps and doors creaking on their own. It was on one of these nights, while I was working my early shift, that I decided to investigate. I was determined to discover the truth about the unknown patient, armed with a flashlight and stubborn courage. I went down to the basement, where the air was cold and damp, and the silence was interrupted only by the distant sound of dripping water. When I reached the patient's room door, I found it locked. But like every curious young woman, I had already gotten the key from one of the veteran nurses, Pedro, who was also intrigued by the mystery. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a scene that left me cold. The room was small, dimly lit, and there was a man lying on a bed in the center. His eyes were closed and he appeared to be in a deep coma. As I approached, I felt a wave of oppression. The air seemed thicker, difficult to breathe. The patient, identified only as Halio in his medical records, was pale, with strange scars on his arms and face. A dark aura seemed to surround him, and there was something deeply wrong in that room. As I scanned my surroundings, I noticed a diary on the table next to the bed. I picked it up and started reading. The notes belonged to Dr. Augusto, the doctor responsible for the patient, and were disturbing. They talked about rituals performed in an attempt to prolong life and bring back vitality, but which resulted in terrible consequences. Helio was the last subject of these experiments, and his condition was a mixture of medical failure and something supernatural. Suddenly, I heard a scuffling sound coming from behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispers became more audible. I felt a presence around me, something evil that seemed to be watching my every move. "Clara, you shouldn't be here." A soft but firm voice echoed through the room. Pedro had followed me, worried about my safety. His eyes were wide, and he looked just as scared as I felt. He told me that the hospital had a dark history, and that many employees believed that Helio's presence was linked to a series of inexplicable and tragic events that had occurred over the years. As we discussed what to do next, I felt a chill run down my spine. Helio had opened his eyes. They were empty, as if their soul was lost. He mumbled unintelligible words, and the temperature in the room dropped drastically. "We need to get out of here now," Pedro whispered, pulling me by the hand. We ran out of the room, locking the door behind us. But the feeling of oppression followed us, as if an invisible shadow was chasing us. In the following days, disturbing events began to occur at the hospital. Objects moved on their own, lights flashed incessantly, and Helio's whispers echoed through the empty corridors. We decided to tell the hospital director, Dr. Matias, about what we had discovered. He listened to us carefully but seemed skeptical. However, he agreed to allow us to investigate further as long as we did not cause panic among the employees. We spent nights reviewing old records and interviewing veteran employees. We discovered that Dr. Augusto had been obsessed with the idea of eternal life and used the hospital as his personal laboratory. Helio was a terminally ill patient who volunteered for the experiments in the hope of being cured, but ended up becoming a victim of something much more sinister. Dr. Augusto's notes detailed dark rituals that he had learned from old occult books. He believed he could transfer the soul from one body to another, cheating death. But instead, he awakened an evil entity that now inhabited Helio's body. With this new information, we knew we needed to do something to end the curse that was hanging over the hospital. Pedro suggested that we perform an exorcism ritual to free Helio's soul and banish the entity. Reluctantly, but with no other options, I agreed. On the night of the exorcism, the atmosphere was tense. Helio's room seemed darker and more oppressive than ever. We began to recite the prayers that we had found in Dr. Augusto's diaries, lighting candles and spreading salt around Helio's bed. As we recited the sacred words, Helio began to writhe and scream. The shadows around us shook violently, and the room shook. We felt the presence of the entity fighting against our efforts. Pedro continued with his prayers, his voice becoming louder and more determined. Suddenly, Helio opened his eyes again, but this time they were filled with an ominous light. The entity had taken complete control. I felt an invisible force pull me back, and the candles went out. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Helio's heavy breathing. "You will never be able to banish me," said the entity through Helio, his voice echoing with a supernatural tone. Pedro and I didn't give up. We continued to recite the prayers, fighting the invisible force that tried to push us away. We felt we were reaching the climax of the battle. Helio began to twitch again, and the room became even colder. Finally, with a deafening scream, the entity was expelled from Helio's body. The shadows dissipated, and the room returned to its normal state. Helio fell back onto the bed, unconscious, but now he seemed to be at peace. We knew that the evil spirit could return, but for now the hospital was free from its influence. Dr. Matias agreed to seal the basement and ensure that no one else had access to that cursed room. Pedro and I continued to work at the hospital, but our lives were never the same. The scars left by this experience have stayed with us, constantly reminding us of what we faced, but, at least for now, the threat had been contained. However, I knew that this would not be the last time we would face the supernatural. Some Lucas hospital, with its dark past, would always keep secrets that could one day emerge again, bringing new horrors to those who dared to investigate. The experience with Helio left a deep mark on me and Pedro. The hallways of St. Luke's Hospital, which had once merely seemed old and worn, now carried an aura of mystery and danger. Every shadow seemed to harbor a secret, and every sound seemed a harbinger of something terrible. The feeling of oppression, although lessened, never completely disappeared. The first few days after the exorcism were relatively peaceful. Halio remained in a comatose state, but the peace on his face was evident. However, I started to notice small changes that made me uneasy. Objects that I was sure I had placed in one place appeared in another, and lights flickered for no apparent reason. It was as if the hospital was trying to communicate something. One night, as I was walking down the third-floor hallway, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature seemed to have dropped drastically, and a thin fog began to form. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening, when I heard a low, indistinct whisper. The voice was soft, but carried a tone of desperation. Clear, called the voice, almost like a lament. I followed the sound, which seemed to come from a room at the end of the hall. Every step I took increased my sense of terror. When I reached the door to room 303, I noticed it was ajar. I pushed it slowly and entered. The room was in complete darkness, except for a point of light emanating from a corner. There I saw a shadowy, indistinct figure with empty eyes that seemed to watch me. The figure began to slowly move towards me, and panic took over me. I felt my legs tremble and my breathing quicken. "Who are you? What you want from me?" I asked, trying to remain calm. The figure stopped, and for a moment there was absolute silence. Then, the voice echoed again, louder and clearer this time. "You freed a part of me, but there is more, much more." The voice seemed to come from everywhere, filling the room with a sense of despair. Suddenly, the figure dissolved into a mist, and the room returned to normal. I ran back to the infirmary, where I found Pedro. I told him what had happened, and he was visibly worried. "Clara, we need to find out what's really going on here. It seems that the spirit we faced was just a part of something much bigger," said Pedro with a serious expression. Over the next few days, we began to delve deeper into the hospital's archives, looking for any clues that could help us. We discovered that Dr. Augusto was not the only doctor involved in the dark rituals. There were others, names that had been erased from official records but still left traces in old documents and hidden letters. One of these letters mentioned a circle of protection in the hospital, where rituals were performed to keep entities contained. We decided to find this circle and find out if it was still active. We knew that the key to ending the terror that haunted the hospital was linked to these rituals. After several nights of searching, we found a hidden room in the hospital's basement, protected by a rusty iron door. When we finally managed to open it, we saw strange symbols engraved on the walls and floor, forming a large circle in the center of the room. The air was thick and cold, and the feeling of oppression was almost unbearable. In the center of the circle, there was a small table with unlit candles and an old book. We leafed through the book, finding detailed instructions for performing protection and banishing rituals. We decided to light the candles and follow the instructions in the book, hoping to strengthen the circle and keep the entities at bay. As we recited the words of the ritual, the room began to shake and the symbols on the walls began to glow with an unearthly light. We felt the presence of entities around us, fighting against the power of the circle. Suddenly the candles went out, and a shadowy figure appeared in the center of the circle, looking directly at us. "You can't keep me forever," said the figure, his voice reverberating off the walls. With supreme effort, we continued to recite the words of the ritual, our voices growing in intensity. The figure began to disintegrate, screaming in agony. The shadows around us receded, and the room fell completely silent. We felt a strange peace, but we knew our battle was far from over. The hospital still held many dark secrets, and we knew we would need to be vigilant to protect those who worked and lived there. That night, as we walked back to our rooms, we felt like we had made some progress, but the feeling of oppression was still there, like a lingering shadow. We knew that St. Luke's Hospital continued to be a place of dark mysteries, and that our fight against the forces of evil was just beginning. As we were getting ready for bed, we heard a distant sound, almost like an echo, coming from the dark corridors of the hospital. It was a reminder that although we had achieved a temporary victory, true terror still lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. In the small village of Pedra Negra, Hospital San Lucas, with its ancient corridors and history full of mysteries, continued to be a place of oppression and fear. The entities we faced seemed to be contained, but the feeling of something dark lurking never left us. In the days following the underground ritual, the hospital seemed calmer. Patients and staff began to feel safer, and normalcy finally seemed to be setting in. However, Clara, Pedro, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still very wrong. One night as I was making my rounds, I felt that familiar chill again. The lights in the hallway flickered, and a fine mist began to form. My heart quickened when I heard the familiar whisper, this time more urgent and insistent. "Clear." The voice seemed closer, more desperate. I decided to follow the sound, taking me back to the basement where we had performed the ritual. The iron door was ajar, and a faint light emanated from within. I cautiously pushed the door open, finding the room in a different state. The candles were lit again, and the symbols on the walls glowed with frightening intensity. In the center of the circle, where before there was a void, there was now a figure with its back to me. The figure was muttering something, and a chill ran down my spine when I realized it was Helio, the unknown patient. His appearance was even more terrifying, with eyes that now glowed an ominous red. "Helios," I called, my voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" He turned slowly, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "Clara, you don't understand. You will never understand." His voice was an icy whisper. "I'm not the problem. I am the solution." Before I could react, the shadows around us began to move violently, as if they had a life of their own. The room shook, and I felt an overwhelming presence trying to hold me in place. Helio raised a hand, and an invisible force pushed me against the wall, holding me firmly. Pedro, who had sensed my absence and decided to follow me, appeared at the door. His eyes widened when he saw Helio and the chaos around us. Without hesitation, he began reciting the words of the ritual, hoping to contain the entity. Helio laughed, a sound that reverberated throughout the room. "Do you think you can stop me? I am eternal." His voice echoed, increasing the terror we felt. Pedro continued, his voice gaining strength. The shadows began to retreat, and Helio's figure seemed to disintegrate again. But then, he did something unexpected. With a quick movement, Helio grabbed one of the surgical instruments from the table and stabbed it into his own chest, causing a sinister light to explode from his body. The ground beneath us began to crack, and an even deeper darkness emerged. Screams echoed from the depths, and a new, even more terrible entity began to materialize. Pedro and I fought against the overwhelming force pulling us into the darkness. With a final effort, Peter launched the final prayer, and the room was filled with blinding light. The entity let out a deafening scream and disappeared into the darkness. The cracks in the ground began to close, and silence reigned again. We felt a strange peace, but we knew the battle was far from over. The hospital still held many dark secrets, and we knew we would need to be vigilant to protect those who worked and lived there. When we finally left the room, I looked at Pedro and noticed that his hands were shaking. The fight had left deep marks on both of us. We walked slowly down the hallway, feeling the weight of everything we had faced. However, upon reaching the surface, a distant and familiar sound made us stop. I looked at Pedro, and he returned a look of mutual understanding. In the back of our minds, we knew that the true terror still lurked in the shadows, waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself again. As we returned to our rooms, we knew that St. Luke's Hospital continued to be a place of dark mysteries and that our fight against the forces of evil was just beginning. The night was not yet over, and the true terror still awaited. In the peaceful city of Santa Teresa, where modernity seemed to have stagnated, Julia received the news of the death of her grandmother, Donna Isabel. The news shook her deeply, as Isabel had always been a constant and caring presence in her life. After the funeral, Julia inherited her grandmother's old house, an imposing but time-worn building located on the outskirts of the city. Inside the house, a surprise awaited: an old landline telephone, the kind with a rotary dial, which seemed to have resisted technological advances. Despite being disconnected, the phone was about to become the catalyst for frightening events. My name is Julia. After my grandmother's death, I decided to move to her old house, looking for a fresh start and, in a way, keeping her memory alive. The house, although old, had an undeniable charm, with its dark wood furniture, large windows, and lace curtains that filtered the sunlight in a soft and welcoming way. But there was something strange in the air, a feeling that time had stopped there, and not in a good way. The first few days were dedicated to organization and cleaning. Among my grandmother's belongings, I found the landline. It sat in a corner of the living room, covered in dust as if no one had used it in years. I remembered seeing it in use when I was a kid, but now it looked more like a museum piece. I decided to leave it there, a reminder of times gone by. The first night I slept soundly, exhausted from the organization work. But the next night I was woken from a restless sleep by a strange sound. I looked around, trying to understand what had woken me up, and that's when I heard it. The phone was ringing. I was paralyzed for a moment. How could it be playing if it was disconnected? I slowly got up and, with my heart beating fast, answered the phone. Hello? My voice came out shaky. There was no immediate response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other side. Then a whispering voice that sounded distant and distorted said, "Help me, please help me." I hung up the phone, feeling an icy cold run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the sound of breathing still echoed in my mind. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Over the next few days, the phone rang every night at midnight, always with the same pleading voice. I began to feel the presence of something dark in the house. Objects moved around, shadows moved on the walls, and whispers echoed through the corridors. It was getting harder and harder to ignore what was happening. I told my friend Marcos, a convinced skeptic, about the phone calls, but even he seemed concerned about my growing paranoia. "Julia, you are tired and stressed. You need a rest," he would say, trying to reassure me. But I knew there was something very wrong. I decided to investigate the phone's history. I went to the local library and looked through the old archives. I discovered that decades ago there was a series of murders in Santa Teresa. The victims received threatening phone calls before they died, and the killer was never caught. A disturbing detail: all the victims had some connection to my grandmother. The connection left me cold. I returned home with a growing sense of dread. The idea that my grandmother could be involved in any way was unbearable. That night, the phone rang again. I answered, my voice barely coming out. "Donna Isabel," the voice whispered. "You need to complete what I started." My heart skipped a beat. "Who are you? What do you want?" I screamed. The response was a low, menacing laugh, followed by a click. I sat in the dark, shaking, trying to understand what was happening. The following days were torment. I felt watched all the time. Marcos, noticing my condition, decided to stay with me for a few nights. He brought with him a series of equipment, determined to prove that it was all a coincidence or perhaps an elaborate prank. On the first night, everything seemed calm. But around midnight, the phone rang again. Marcos, skeptical as always, answered. His expression quickly changed from curiosity to dread. He heard the same voice I heard, and his disbelief was replaced by palpable fear. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The answer was the same. "Help me, please help me." And then the click. Marcos hung up the phone and looked at me, pale. "This isn't normal, Julia. We need help." We decided to seek more information about the murders. We visited my grandmother's old friends, but no one wanted to talk about the past. It was then that we met Donna Carmem, an elderly woman who had been a close friend of Isabel. She welcomed us into her home with a tired look, as if she had been waiting for our visit. "I knew this day would come," she said, sighing. Her grandmother, Julia, was involved in something very dangerous. She tried to protect people, but ended up getting too involved. Donna Carmem said that Isabel had discovered that the killer used the telephone to manipulate his victims, invoking an evil spirit that fed on fear and despair. Isabel tried to stop the rituals, but she couldn't. The spirit now seemed to be trapped in the phone, searching for someone to complete its cycle of terror. We returned to the house with our heads full of questions and fear. That night, we decided to record the calls. When the phone rang, I answered and heard the same voice. This time she seemed more desperate. Closer. "You need to finish what she started, or there will never be peace." After hanging up, we listened to the recording. The voice was unmistakably human, but there was something more. An underlying whisper that seemed to come from another place. Another reality. Marcos suggested performing a banishing ritual that he had found in ancient records. He believed we could free the spirit and end the torment. Although skeptical, I agreed. Anything was better than living in that nightmare. We prepared everything for the ritual: candles, incense, and my grandmother's old diary, which contained notes about the rituals. At midnight, when the phone rang, we were ready. Marcos began reciting the words of banishment, and the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The phone seemed to vibrate with an energy of its own, and the voice on the other end became more frantic. "No, you cannot do that. You need to help me." The candles flickered and a shadow formed on the wall, a grotesque and distorted figure. Marcos continued reciting, his voice shaking but steady. The figure advanced on us, and I felt an icy cold take over my body. Suddenly, the phone exploded in a shower of sparks, and the figure disappeared with an agonized scream. The room became silent. The temperature returned to normal, and we felt an unexpected peace. We thought it was all over. But the next morning when I woke up, I found a message written on the bathroom mirror. "This isn't over." The following nights were a mixture of calm and tension. Even though the phone no longer rang, I felt something was still wrong. Marcos and I tried to move on, but the shadow of what we experienced still hung over us. We decided to look deeper into my grandmother's past and the real motive behind the murders. In one of Isabel's old letters, we find mention of a secret society that practiced rituals to invoke spirits. Apparently, my grandmother had infiltrated this group to try to stop her activities. We realized that the spirit on the phone was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a much more powerful and ancient entity. One night, while we were reviewing documents, I heard a sound coming from the basement. We went down together, armed with a flashlight and a recorder. At the bottom of the basement, we found an old locked chest. When we finally managed to open it, we discovered a set of old books, strange symbols, and a portrait of my grandmother surrounded by people she had never seen before. Marcos picked up one of the books and started leafing through it. "Julia, this is much older than we imagine. We are dealing with something that goes beyond our understanding." Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. We stood in the dark, feeling a presence around us. Whispers began to echo through the basement, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same figure he had seen in the room, but now it was more defined, more real. "You can't run away," the figure said, his voice echoing through the basement. The air turned cold, and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. Marcos and I were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The figure slowly advanced, its grotesque and distorted appearance becoming clearer with each step. "You have called upon forces you do not understand. Now they will pay the price." Marcos tried to recite the banishing ritual again, but his voice was weak, almost inaudible. The figure laughed, a sound that resonated like breaking glass. "Words cannot stop me," she said, extending a skeletal hand towards us. Suddenly, the flashlight came on again, but the light was weak and blinked incessantly. On the ground around the chest, symbols began to glow with an ominous red light. I felt a cold hand grab my arm and, instinctively, I pulled Marcos back, trying to move us away from the figure. "Run!" I shouted, and with one last effort we moved toward the stairs. We ran upstairs, the sound of heavy footsteps and heavy breathing following us. We slammed the basement door shut, pushing furniture to block the entrance. Our relief was momentary. The phone, now destroyed, started ringing again. The sound was impossible but real, echoing through the room. I looked at Marcos, who was as pale as me. We knew we weren't safe. "We have to get out of here," he said, taking my hand. "We can't stay in this house." We ran out to the car, the darkness of the night swallowing us. The engine took a while to start, and every second seemed like an eternity. Finally, we managed to leave, leaving the house behind. As we drove, the car phone rang, a high-pitched, disturbing sound. I answered with shaking hands. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was the same, but now it sounded closer, more urgent. "You can't escape. Wherever they go, I will find them." I hung up, dread taking over me. "Marcos, this is not going to end, no matter where we are. We have to find a way to end this once and for all," he replied, determination in his voice mixed with fear. "Let's go to Donna Carmen's house. Maybe she knows what to do." We drove in silence, the weight of fear crushing us. When we arrived at Donna Carmen's house, she welcomed us with a look of understanding and concern. "I knew this wouldn't end easily," she said, leading us inside. We sat in their cozy living room, the soft candlelight offering a bit of comfort. "You are dealing with a vengeful spirit, an entity that feeds on fear and despair," explained Carmen. "The only way to end this is to directly confront the entity and undo the original ritual." She gave us a protective amulet and began preparing items for a more powerful ritual. "We need to go back to your grandmother's house, Julia. That's where it all began, and that's where it must end." The idea of going back to that house terrified me. But I knew it was our only chance. We returned with Carmen, every shadow on the road looking like a threat. When we arrived, the house was silent, but the feeling of oppression was almost palpable. Carmen led us to the basement where the symbols still glowed faintly on the floor. "Let us undo the ritual and banish the entity once and for all," she said, beginning to recite ancient words, her voice firm and assured. The shadows around us began to move again, and the figure appeared angrier than ever. "You cannot stop me," roared the entity, advancing upon us. Marcos and I held the amulet tightly, while Carmen continued the ritual. The candlelight flickered and the figure tried to break through the protective barrier that surrounded us. We felt the pressure increasing, as if the entity was trying to crush us. With one last effort, Carmen recited the final words of the ritual, and the figure let out a deafening scream. The shadows dissipated, and the red light disappeared. The entity was banned, and peace returned to the basement. We lay there, breathless and exhausted, but relieved. "We did it," said Carmen with a tired smile. "Finally, you are free." We left the house, leaving behind the horrors we faced. We knew that the entity was banned, but the scars of fear would still remain. Life has returned to normal, but we always carry the memory of what we faced, and so my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true peace, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. As Donna Carmen guided us out of the basement, the feeling of relief began to set in. However, something bothered me. The house was too quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting. We said goodbye to Carmen at the door. "You'll be safe now," she said with a tired smile. "But remember, vigilance is necessary. Entities like this never completely disappear." We walked back to the car, feeling the first breeze of real tranquility in weeks. We drove along the deserted road, the headlight illuminating the narrow, winding path. The silence in the car was comforting, but I soon noticed something strange. I looked at Marcos, who was pale, his eyes fixed on the road. "Marcos, what happened?" I asked, trying to remain calm. He didn't respond immediately. I feel like something is wrong. Ever since we left, I've had this feeling that we're being followed. I looked in the rearview mirror but saw nothing but darkness. It's just the trauma of everything we've been through. I tried to comfort him, but the feeling of overwhelm was returning. Suddenly, the car radio turned on by itself. A static hiss filled the air, followed by the same whispering voice we heard before. "Do you think you escaped?" Absolute dread gripped me. Marcos tried to turn off the radio, but it didn't respond. The voice continued, laughing softly. "Did you think a simple ritual could banish me?" The car began to slow down, despite Marcos pressing the accelerator. "What is happening?" he shouted, struggling with the steering wheel. The headlights were flashing and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The car stopped completely and the engine died. We were stuck in the middle of the deserted road, darkness enveloping us. I felt an icy cold run up my spine and heard footsteps coming from outside. I looked out the window and saw shadows moving quickly around the car. "We have to get out of here," I shouted, but the doors were locked. Marcos and I struggled to open them, but it was useless. Suddenly the radio changed stations, playing an old and disturbing melody. The voice returned, now closer and clearer. "You opened the door for me, and now I will never leave you." The windows began to fog up and words formed on the glass, written by an invisible hand. "I am here." Marcos finally managed to open the driver's door and ran out. "Come on, Julia," he shouted. But before I could move, I felt a cold hand grab my ankle. I looked down and saw a shadowy figure pulling me out of the car. I screamed, but the sound was muffled by the radio. The figure pulled me onto the road, and I felt darkness completely envelop me. Marcos tried to reach me, but something invisible stopped him. The last thing I saw was his desperate face as the darkness consumed me. I felt a piercing cold, and the whispering voice was now inside my mind. "You are mine now," she said, and I knew there was no escape. The entity had marked us, and no matter where we went, it would follow us. I woke up in a dark and cold place, with the feeling of being watched. I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness. I heard Marcos's voice in the distance, calling my name, but I knew I was trapped. The entity had separated us, and now we were at the mercy of its will. As I write these words, I know that true peace will never be achieved. The entity is always present, waiting, watching. And so our story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. The darkness does not retreat, but hides, ready to strike again when we least expect it.